He thought he was untouchable, a loud, arrogant tourist who crossed not just the line on the ground, but the line of respect. Waving his cap and mocking the Queen's guard, he laughed, convinced his money gave him the right to anything. But when the guard took a single step and spoke a single word, the crowd froze, and the star of the show became the fool of the day. What happened next? It's a moment no one will forget. Let's start from the beginning. It was a typical afternoon at Buckingham Palace. Tourists packed the square, cameras snapping, voices rising over each other in a chaotic hum. In the middle of it all, the Queen's guard stood motionless, tall, rigid, and untouchable. His crimson coat gleamed in the faint sunlight, and the heavy bearskin hat shadowed his face. He was a symbol of discipline, a fixture of tradition that didn't waver, no matter the chaos around him. And then came him. "Hey, you!" The voice cut through the crowd. Heads turned toward the source, a tall American in a wrinkled London Rules t-shirt and cargo shorts. He grinned as though he'd just discovered the punchline to some great joke. "Come on, man, smile for the camera. You're part of the experience, right?" A few people chuckled nervously. The guard didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, as unmovable as stone. The tourist wasn't satisfied. He took a step closer, waving a crumpled dollar bill in the air. "What if I pay you, huh? $1 for a smile. That's fair." The tension thickened. A mother pulled her son closer, scowling. An older man shook his head and muttered, "Shameful." The tourist smirked and spread his arms. "Come on! You're a statue in a fuzzy hat. We paid to see this. You work for us." Silence. The crowd shifted uneasily. Someone raised their phone to record. The guard remained still, unbothered, but the energy changed. The tourist didn't see it. He grinned wider, mistaking the guard's silence for victory. He stepped forward again, his sneakers nearly touching the white line. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, buddy?" The old man with the cane finally spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. "Young man, I'd stop there if I were you." The tourist glanced back, grinning. "Relax, Pops. It's just for fun." He turned back to the guard, eyes glinting with a mix of arrogance and stupidity. He didn't realize it yet, but he'd crossed a line he shouldn't have. And the guard? He stood, unblinking, unshaken. The crowd had already shifted uncomfortably, sensing that things were teetering on the edge of awkward and about to get ugly. But the tourist? He wasn't done. Guys like this never are. He moved closer to the white line, the boundary everyone knows you don't cross. It's there for a reason, and no sane person would think otherwise. But this guy wasn't just ignorant. He was confidently ignorant. "What happens if I just do this?" His sneaker slid forward, crossing the line by an inch. It was small, but it was enough. For one breathless moment, the entire square went silent. Even the pigeons seemed to stop mid-flap. And then it happened. The guard moved. It wasn't a lot, just one sharp, deliberate step forward. But the sound of his boot slamming against the stone cut through the silence like a gunshot. The echo bounced off the palace walls. Then came the voice. "Stay behind the line!" It wasn't a yell. It was a command. A sound so firm and authoritative, it didn't just travel to your ears. It punched you in the chest. The tourist stumbled back like he touched a live wire, his face flushing red. For half a second, you'd think he'd back down. That maybe he'd finally realized this wasn't the time to be the main character. But no. Guys like him don't back down. They double down. He laughed. A nervous, forced sound, like he was trying to convince the crowd, and maybe himself, that this was still funny. "Relax, soldier boy. No one's storming the castle here." The grin was back. The arrogance was back. He whipped his baseball cap off his head and waved it toward the guard's tall bearskin hat like a matador teasing a bull. "Is this thing heavy? I gotta know, man. What's under there, huh?" And just like that, the crowd turned. The laughter stopped. A ripple of irritation spread through the onlookers. The mother who'd been clutching her son pulled him closer and spat. "What a disgrace!" The old man with the cane let out a loud, disgusted snort. "No respect. None at all." A teenage girl nearby muttered, "Seriously? He thinks this is funny? As she angled her phone to record. The tourist, oblivious, kept going. He jabbed a finger toward the guard, clearly proud of himself for being the loudest person in the square. You're supposed to entertain us. That's the whole point, right? The guard didn't flinch. Not even a blink. He was stone, colder than the marble underfoot, harder than the tourist's inflated ego. But here's the thing. The silence, the stillness, it made the tourist look ridiculous. He was flailing, waving his hat around like a fool, while the guard exuded nothing but dignity. It was like watching a man try to pick a fight with a mountain. The tension thickened. People weren't just uncomfortable now. They were angry. A woman in sunglasses crossed her arms and hissed, "Someone get him out of here!" But the tourist was too deep in his own delusion to notice. In his mind, he was the star of the show. The guy with the funny story to tell later. "What's the matter, buddy? You're just part of the scenery. I'm the one paying for this trip." And there it was. The line. Not the white one on the ground. The invisible one of respect that civilized people don't cross. Phones were up. Someone was live streaming. A kid whispered, "He's gonna regret this." And honestly, he was right. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And then it happened. Somewhere behind the smug tourist, a small trembling sob broke the air. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the uneasy silence like a bell. The crowd turned. Standing near the front, a little girl, no older than 5, clutched her mother's hand, her wide eyes brimming with tears. She flinched at the loud voices and the tourist's aggressive antics. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering something calming, but the damage was done. This wasn't funny anymore. This wasn't some harmless joke. The guard moved. It was subtle, deliberate, and completely unexpected. His right boot slid forward, slow and controlled, as though he were breaking through the earth itself. Then, in a move that seemed to defy every rule of his silent discipline, the guard turned his head, slightly, just enough for everyone to see it. It was like watching a statue come to life. The crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "He moved!" Phones shot up to capture the impossible moment, but no one was laughing now. The guard extended his arm, his gloved hand snapping into a sharp point at the white line on the ground. His voice, low, firm, and resonant, rang out, echoing through the square. "Step back." There was no anger in his voice, no shouting, just command, absolute, unshakable authority. The tourist froze. His grin faltered as the weight of the moment finally hit him. This wasn't a joke anymore. The crowd that had been quietly judging him now stared openly, and the shift in their expressions was clear. "You're the problem." For once, he didn't have anything to say. The little girl sniffled again, pulling the focus back to her. And at that moment, the situation clicked for everyone. This wasn't just about tradition or rules, it was about dignity, about adults acting like adults and setting an example. A sharp voice broke through the heavy air. "Young man!" It was the old man with the cane. He stepped forward, his face stern and disapproving, the kind of expression that could shame anyone with half a conscience. "This guard is not here for your amusement. He's not part of your trip. He stands here for something far greater than you could ever understand. You would do well to show some respect." The crowd murmured in agreement. A few people nodded. Others muttered things like, "About time someone said it," and "What a disgrace." A slow, deliberate clap started. It came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, then another and another, until the small applause swelled into a wave of support. People weren't just applauding the guard, they were applauding the moment. This quiet, powerful reclaiming of respect and decency. The tourist's face went crimson. He looked like he wanted to argue, to crack another joke, but even he wasn't stupid enough to fight against 100 disapproving eyes. His shoulders slumped, and he backed away, 1 step, then 2, until he was safely behind the white line. The guard, meanwhile, had already returned to his position, as if nothing had happened. He was still, immaculate, the perfect embodiment of duty and discipline. And yet, in that tiny moment, a single glance, a quiet word, he had reminded an entire crowd what respect looked like. For the little girl, it was enough. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and whispered to her mother, "He's a hero." The mother smiled softly, her eyes lingering on the guard. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." And just like that, the air shifted. The tension broke. The square didn't feel chaotic anymore. It felt right. The tourist slinked away into the crowd, now just another face among many. No one watched him leave. No one cared. All eyes were still on the guard, who stood tall, unshaken, and unbothered. The phones were still recording, of course. And before long, the videos would explode across the internet with titles like, "Tourists shamed for disrespecting the Queen's Guard. Crowd goes wild. This is what happens when you cross the line." But in the square, there were no hashtags, no trending topics, just a quiet shared understanding. Respect is earned, and sometimes it's demanded. For a man who thought he had the whole world laughing with him, the tourist suddenly looked very small. The grin was gone, replaced by a sheepish, uncomfortable twitch of his mouth. His eyes darted toward the crowd, searching for an ally, but all he found were glares, crossed arms, and shaking heads. He stepped back, one foot, then the other, like a kid who'd just been caught breaking something valuable. His sneakers landed behind the white line, where they should have stayed all along. A woman's voice cut through the tension, sharp and loud. "Hope you got your show. You're embarrassing yourself." The old man with the cane added a final jab, his tone dripping with disdain. "Some things are worth more than your vacation photos, young man." The tourist's face burned red as he shoved his baseball cap back onto his head. He muttered something no one could hear, probably another excuse. But by now, no one cared. He slinked away into the crowd, swallowed up by the same people who had watched him embarrass himself. And the guard? He was back. Back to his post, back to perfect stillness, as if the entire confrontation had never happened. His jawline was sharp, his stance immovable. He didn't need to respond because his silence said it all. "This isn't for you. This is bigger than you." Phones were still raised, of course. The moment had been captured from every angle. The little girl, now calmer, stared up at the guard with wide eyes, whispering to her mom, "He's like a superhero." Her mother smiled softly, brushing the girl's hair back. "He's protecting something important, sweetheart." The scene began to shift. The tension faded, replaced by an odd reverence. People who had laughed earlier now stood straighter, their voices hushed. A few moved closer to the white line, not to cross it, but to show their respect. An elderly couple stepped forward. The man, with a military pin on his lapel, stopped a foot from the line, straightened his spine, and placed a hand over his heart. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice low but firm. The guard didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The respect in the man's voice was acknowledgement enough. A little boy in the crowd waved shyly at the guard. "Bye, Mr. Soldier," he chirped, his small voice cutting through the quiet. Of course, the guard didn't wave back. He didn't even blink. But in that moment, he didn't need to. The crowd understood. Sometimes, saying nothing is the most powerful thing you can do. By the time the tourist had disappeared completely, the first video was already going viral. Headlines practically wrote themselves. "Obnoxious tourist gets humiliated after crossing the line. Queen's Guard teaches a lesson in respect." This is what happens when you mess with tradition. And in the comments section, the internet had it say, "Finally, someone stood up for tradition. That guard's a legend. How entitled do you have to be to act like that? Shameful. Respect is earned, not bought." This guy needed that lesson. The guard remained where he always was, unmoved, unbothered, and unshakable. He didn't bask in the attention or acknowledge the whispers of admiration. He didn't need to. In a world that changes faster than anyone can keep up with, he was a constant. A reminder that some things, honor, discipline, tradition, aren't for sale, no matter how much someone pays for their vacation. As the crowd began to thin, the old man with the cane turned to the mother and her daughter and muttered, "Maybe there's hope for us yet." And the guard? He stood tall against the afternoon sky, a silent figure who had spoken louder than anyone else in that square. Respect. It's not given. It's earned. And for those who don't understand that, well, sometimes a quiet hero is enough to remind them.